Great to have you all here with us. My name is Reverend Susie Hayward. I serve as the Minister of Justice and Formation here at Creekside UCC, and we are so glad to have all of you here with us in person, and those who are joining us online, welcome. And welcome especially to our two guests, Angela Denker and Matt Taylor, who are here tonight to engage each other and all of us in a conversation about Christian nationalism and the threat it poses to us in this moment, to our democracy, and what we can do to protect democracy and each other in the face of this real and growing threat in our country. So a few words of housekeeping before we get started. If you need to use a bathroom, we have bathrooms up here down the hall. There's a gender-neutral bathroom all the way at the end of the hall. There's more bathrooms downstairs if there's a run on bathrooms at some point. Please do remember to silence your cell phones. And we have question cards that were handed out, little index cards. If you didn't get one, you can run back there at any point, or our usher, raise your hand, and our usher will come around and give you one now. We'll collect the cards later in our event tonight. I'll say the word and then just pass them down to the end of your pew. That the tax you get, those of you who got the coveted seat at the end of the pews, is that you have to collect those index cards from your fellow pew seat mates when they come down the aisle, and then our ushers will collect them and bring them up. I want to give a special thanks to Minnesota Christians Against Christian Nationalism and Jerry Gale for the support of this event tonight, and to our Isaiah representatives from Creekside, who are here to share with you towards the end of this event an upcoming intangible way that you can get involved in a mass resistance effort against Christian nationalism. So stay tuned for that. And I think that's it for my housekeeping. So we're just going to kick into it now. And I'm not going to do a lengthy intro of our guests. I hope that's okay with you both, because you have a lengthy intro to them in your bulletin. But suffice to say that we are lucky to have them here with us to help us make sense of this moment, and especially to Matt, who is here in town from Baltimore. So thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
And I'm going to start out with what I hope is an easy one for you. I would like to hear you both define what Christian nationalism is. Matt?
You want me to go first?
I want you to go first.
So I think of Christian nationalism less as a movement. A lot of people want to say the Christian nationalist movement. I think that that's actually a little too simple. I think of Christian nationalism as a tendency, as a way of thinking, as a habit of mind that is very, very deeply ingrained within American culture, but is also outside of American culture. There are many forms of Christian nationalism that are not American. There's Christian nationalism in Russia that's very much built around a kind of Russian Orthodox sensibility of what it means to be Christian. That is very, very different from most of the Christian expressions we have in the United States. There is Christian nationalism in Brazil. There's Christian nationalism in Hungary. There's Christian nationalism in Nigeria. That each has different flavors coming from the different cultures that are there. And then I would say within Christian nationalism, there are a whole bunch of different species of Christian nationalism. Even in the United States, I would say there's at least 5 or 6 different major strands of Christian nationalism coming out of different strands of theology, ecclesiology, congregations, all these sorts of things. So I think of Christian nationalism as and really religious nationalism in general is you're blending together different layers of your identity that many of us would prefer to keep separate, right? So nationality, race, ethnicity, those often get paired together. And then religion is the layer of our identity that wants to make sense of the world, right? Make meaning in the world. And so it's easy for religion to get blended with other elements of our identity. It's not always a bad thing for it to blend with other elements of our identity. We want to make sense of our sexuality. We want to make sense of what is happening around us, our location within history. And so I think it's not necessarily natural, but expected that people would sometimes blend that with their nationality.
Thank you.
Is my mic a little funny?
It's going to now.
No?
Scooch it up. Thank you. Angela,
Yeah.
Christian nationalism, what is it for you?
Well, and I really appreciate, first of all, that movement to move Christian nationalism outside of our immediate American partisan context, because I think that there's this American tendency to, first of all, view everything just according to what's happening within the US, but then also we really want to put everything into a red box or a blue box. And so people will immediately think, okay, Christian nationalism, Republican, this is the same thing. And well, certainly, this is a right-wing movement. It's important to distinguish it from Republicanism specifically and to connect it to the historical context. So I've been speaking on Christian nationalism, researching it since 2018, and maybe because of that, I have my definition. So I'm going to read it for all of you. Yes, so I wasn't texting, I was looking for my definition earlier. But let me just read it to you, and then I'm sure we'll get into it deeper as we go through this. But Christian, and again, I come at this from my perspective, right? I've been a Lutheran pastor since 2013. Before that, and since then, I remain a journalist. So this is a definition that is grounded both in journalistic research and also in Lutheran theology and my pastoral experiences in leading congregations. So Christian nationalism is a version of the idolatrous theology of glory, which replaces the genuine worship of God with worship of a particular vision of America. And we'll get into this later, but I will say this is shifting. The idol of Christian nationalism is shifting from sort of a backwards-looking version of America. So we used to see lots of flags, lots of imagery around America. We're now seeing much more strongman imagery. And the idol itself has gone from like a nationalist idol to a much more gendered idol and much more grounded in masculinity. But we'll talk about that further. But worship of a particular version of America, often rooted in a revisionist history of white people in the 1950s. So was this church here in the 1950s?
Sure was.
I always ask this because I'm an ELCA Lutheran in Minnesota. Many of us look back to the 1950s as the glory days of our churches. And there's a natural nostalgia for the church having a central place in society. So what Christian nationalists do is they say, oh, we're going to bring you back to that. But their aim, as we're going to talk about, is not to put the church at the center of society, necessarily not to have full pews, but instead their aim is to go back to a time in America where certain people had more rights than others. So significantly, they want to go back to the 50s because it was before the civil rights movement or the women's movement. So Christian nationalism supports a violent takeover of government. Violence is central here. And the imposition of fundamentalist Christian beliefs on all people. So I think it's important we distinguish this as a fundamentalist movement, primarily fundamentalist rather than conservative. Christian nationalism relies on a theological argument that equates American military sacrifice with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. So the use of the military in understanding and connecting to the atonement of Jesus is also central to the ideology here. It suggests that Christians are entitled to wealth and power, which is in deep contrast to Jesus' theology of the cross, which reminds Christians that they too have to carry their cross just as Jesus did.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate, Angela, that you're going deep into the U.S. version of Christian nationalism, too,
Yes.
speaking to Matt's kind of broader take on religious nationalism writ large, and the fact that it looks different in different places, and here's what it looks like in particular in the U.S. context. Matt, I want to invite you to respond to that, but also you invited us into thinking about there's 5 or 6 different strands. I wonder if you could say a word about what those different strands are. Are we talking about, everything from sort of Proud Boys to the New Apostolic Reformation? Like they are different in some ways and similar in some ways. So I wonder if you can just flesh that out a little bit for us.
Yeah, definitely. And I like, so I would put the parenthetical American before your definition, but other than that, great definition, right? And I think that does capture a lot of these dynamics, right? So there's this infusing of American identity, American paradigms, American sensibilities, especially white American and conservative American sensibilities, into a kind of religious frame that is then being asked to kind of hold that identities, all those identities together as some sort of a coherent whole when they are not coherent. And I think also the inclusion of notions of gender is very important. If we look around religious nationalisms around the world, Christian nationalisms around the world, there is this fixation with gender and gender norms. And again, I think a lot of the impulse towards religious nationalism comes from very, very understandable human impulses. And the reason I think that so much of this obsession is with the 1950s is that our culture has undergone a massive change since starting in the 1960s, right? If you think back to the 1950s, there were many places in the United States where Protestant prayer was still a required part of public school day. It wasn't universal, but there were many school districts where it was, including in Baltimore. And then it was in the 1960s that our Supreme Court changed its jurisprudence around how it calibrated its understanding of the First Amendment, right? And then what are the other changes we undergo in the 1960s? You have the Civil Rights Movement, you have the Sexual Revolution, right? All these things that begin in the 60s, well, that's what the backlash is, that they want to get past that. I would note that I think for some Christian nationalists in the United States, they want to go back to the 1950s. Some of them seemingly want to go back to the 1850s. I'm half joking, but not actually. I mean, if you go and read some of the things that Doug Wilson says in some of these recent interviews that he's been doing, he seemingly wants us to go back more to the 1850s. He's quite comfortable with slavery. The different strands. So one strand that I think I would call white Christian nationalism actually one strand of American Christian nationalism that is especially fixated with race. And for the people within that strand, I would argue that race is actually the primary category and religion's the secondary one. I think there are forms of Christian nationalism that, for lack of a better term, in the United States are actually pretty secular. Let me explain what I mean by that. So if you actually go and look at what the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or these groups say, there's not a lot of God in the way that they talk. They'll talk about Judeo-Christian civilization and protecting the Judeo-Christian state. And they'll go through all these things. And I mean, if you want to just see the direct evidence of this, go and read the texts that the Proud Boys were sending to each other that the January 6th committee released in the lead up to January 6th. They were not talking about God at all. And yet there was a Christian identity that was infused within this kind of white nationalism that they were carrying around that was fairly secular, I'd argue. It did not have a lot of reference to God in it. There's a major strand that we could call the Reconstructionist or Calvinist strand of Christian nationalism. This is the Doug Wilson camp that is comes out of the 1960s, 1970s, and some of the changes that were going on within hardline Calvinism in our country. And then I would say the strand that I study is this non-denominational Pentecostal style of Christian nationalism that has really surged to the forefront in the last decade in the Trump era, in part because Trump has really empowered that crowd. Those are the crowd of evangelical advisors, as Christian advisors, is just stacked with non-denominational Pentecostal type evangelicals. And then there are some smaller strands. I would say there's a vibrant, very influential, but fairly small demographically, Eastern Orthodox strand of Christian nationalism that is very influential online. And I'm trying to think if I've missed any of the big ones.
Catholic one.
Oh yes, sorry. I'm thinking as a Protestant here. Within Catholicism, there's at least one, maybe multiple strands of Christian nationalism. So one is what you could call kind of Catholic integralism that is very erudite, very sophisticated, very obsessed with constitutional law, and is often kind of batted around in legal debates and very influential with the conservatives on the Supreme Court. There's also a more populist and racist version of Christian nationalism that has also taken root within a large segment of the Catholic Church in the United States. And that one, in its more extreme versions, would be very connected with what even the debate that we're seeing in our politics this week around Nick Fuentes and the Groyper movement and these kind of neo-Nazi elements that have attached themselves to parts of Catholicism. So each of those has different flavorings, different kind of theologies that are within it, but they all, I'd say, fit within this kind of broader umbrella of American Christian nationalism.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. And important to keep in mind that I think we tend to sort of homogenize a lot of it when we talk about Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism even. So it's helpful to remember that there are these different strands within it, and people might come together over a shared cause at particular moments, but there's also places of disagreement and tension sometimes within these groups on issues of race and so on and so forth.
And I would say Israel and Jews right now is the live wire that is right now really dividing some of these folks. That is the fight that they're having, this kind of philo-Semitic versus anti-Semitic styles of Christian nationalism. That's a huge fight that is like peaking right now.
Yeah. I want to turn to your books, which we have for sale out in the Narthex from Moon Palace Books. So Angela, maybe we could start with you and you could share a little bit about your projects, especially your most recent one. What is the project? What led you to it? What questions were you seeking to answer in drafting this book or writing this book? And let me just check. Are you able to hear Angela okay with her mic? Okay.
I moved it up a bit too, so I can hear when we're hyper-focused in and out. Yeah, and I wanted to respond to, as we talk about these different overlapping groups, before we started talking tonight, Matt and I were saying that an important thing to understand when you look at Trump's ascent to power and his ongoing hold on power is the way in which he was able to bring some of these formerly disparate groups together. So in the past, Jerry Falwell and Paula White did not see themselves as having much of a common cause. Right. And what Trump has done is bring them together. But I think in criticizing, this movement and pushing back against it, that's some places where we can also find some footholds to understand, well, what has brought them together and what have they ignored in order to come together? And in many cases, what has brought them together is, I think, power.
Yes.
A search for power. and a naked grasp for power above anything else. So these groups have left behind many of the things that they maybe held dear in the past, or they've agreed to ignore their disagreements, because as we talk about these groups, they have very serious disagreements. This Calvinist group led by Doug Wilson would never allow a woman to preach in church, whereas these charismatic groups are much more okay with women being at the forefront of church. The white Christian nationalist group that views much of religion through the lens of race would never want to have diverse church bodies made up of black and white Christians worshiping together, whereas many of these charismatic groups, again, are much more racially diverse. So I think it's important, as we look to find ways to push back, to find ways to say, well, these are the logical inconsistencies, these are the hypocrisy places where these movements are having. And I think that that's an important place to start to poke some holes, as well as when it comes to Israel. And looking at the natural, yes, these groups may be more or less different in their embrace of naked anti-Semitism, but even for the groups that are most supportive of Israel, their theology still says the Jews are not going to heaven unless they're maybe part of the 144, right?
Maybe.
So I think, theology is important. So the new project that I did, after I wrote my first book, Red State Christians, I spent 2018 traveling across the country, interviewing Christians in red states and counties. And the backstory to this book is that the publisher came to me and said, we would really like you to write the Christian version of Hillbilly Elegy. We all know how that story ended. So,
Future vice president.
Not to Donald Trump, probably. But, who knows? I guess J.D. Vance might not have said that either. Definitely kidding. So that book came out in 2019, and then I had the opportunity to add some content to do a new version of the book in 2022 with content from COVID, from George Floyd and the racial uprising after George Floyd, and also racial backlash after George Floyd, and then also content from January 6th. And that new version of the book also deals with my living here in Minneapolis, and then I was serving a congregation as the solo pastor in rural Minnesota. So as we were walking through all of these major national events, many of them politically divisive and different, I was serving a congregation in a county where 80% of the people voted for Trump. So that was a big part of that book. So then after that, I thought, okay, maybe I'm going to take a little step away from politics. I did not know Trump was going to win a second term. And the publisher came to me and said, we're really looking for a book about young men and boys. I'm the mom of 2 boys. I began my career as a sports writer. As a female pastor, I've spent a lot of time in male-dominated spaces. And the statistic that kept coming back to me was that young white men are more likely than any other demographic group to be a mass shooter. And the other statistic that kept coming back to me was that slightly older white men are more likely than any other demographic group to die by suicide. So we had this dual crisis that was not being adequately met in conversation. It was either boys are in so much trouble, we have to help them, or boys are so dangerous. And my argument in the book is that really we have to acknowledge that both of these things are true in order to really address what's going on. So that led to my new book, Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. It's a mixture of some biblical analysis looking at creational theology and the ways that this story of Adam and Eve is used to construct a gender-based hierarchy that is central to much of Christian nationalism, and certainly we see that gender-based hierarchy operating in Trump's second term in ways that I could not have anticipated when I wrote the book, but turned out to be very timely. And the book is also ethnographic research. So I went to the Citadel in South Carolina. I also retraced the steps of mass shooter Dylan Roof, who is also an ELCA Lutheran, came out of an ELCA Lutheran context. And part of my task, I think, in my books, and this is where our work really works well together, I think, because we cover different spaces. part of my task is to help mainline congregations, Christians who see themselves, oh, well, we're not like those Christians. To help us to see as well how baked in much of white Christianity some of this ideology is, and why it's proven fertile ground, to the extent to which ELCA Lutherans, a majority of us, also voted for Donald Trump in 2024. And so I think it's important for mainline, moderate, liberal Christians to understand that we are also part of this movement, and how to root it out and name it in our churches as well as sin, for me as a pastor, as sin, and how do we repent, and how do we build something more rooted in this theology of the cross.
Thank you. Matt, same question to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your book project and what led you to write The Violent Take It by Force?
Yeah, let me just say first, I really like Angela's book a lot. And I was actually just recommending it today to somebody that I just met this week. And I think one of the things I most appreciate about it is I'm also the father of 2 white boys. They're ages 6 and 6 months. So they aren't quite at the stage where they are consuming this stuff. But as somebody who works in that space, I am terrified about what will be coming their way, because it's not just that white men are vulnerable, white men are being targeted by propaganda, by these messages, by these radicalization regimes, and frankly by this truly nihilistic culture that is taking root in some corners of the internet, where a lot of the shooters that we're seeing are coming out of.
Yes.
And it's not merely, and those spaces aren't exclusively Christian, they aren't exclusively white, they aren't exclusively male, but white men get drawn into them in a way that no one else does. So my book, The Violent Take It by Force, is about January 6th, and I was actually drawn into this research by January 6th. I thought I could have a career doing interreligious dialogue with Christians and Muslims and building pluralism, and that was what my first book was about. And it was a very academic book, thinking about the changes that have undergone, quote unquote, radical Islam within America in the aftermath of 9/11, and that was part of my dissertation project in my PhD program. And I sent the manuscript of that book off to the publisher for peer review on the morning of January 6, 2021. And I thought that it would be a day of relief that I had gotten this thing off my desk. I was done with it for a while at least, and then that afternoon I'm trying to keep my preschool-aged children from watching the TV, as I can't take myself from watching it. I grew up evangelical in Southern California, and watching the riot play out and then watching some of the kind of conversations about it afterward, I saw so much of where I had grown up, and the memes, the rhetorics, the theologies that I was raised with. But then I also saw a lot that didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I could recognize it as Christian, but it was not the Christianity I was familiar with. And so I was just frankly very curious. And so I started just trying to understand, who were these people? And I stumbled across pretty early on in my research a sermon. It was a very brief little lecture or talk given. It was on January 5th. The day before, there was a huge rally to kind of stir up the crowds. And it was in Freedom Plaza, just kind of in between, if you're thinking of DC, in between the White House and the Capitol. In Freedom Plaza, there was this mass rally for Trump. And the first half of that rally was all pastors speaking for. It was an 8-hour rally. The first half was all pastors. And one of the pastors was a Korean-American pastor who actually came from the same seminary that I went to, Fuller Seminary. And he was saying things that I found quite shocking. He was talking about, we as Christians are going to rule and reign through Donald Trump under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And he's making these declarations. And his name is Che On, and I just was mystified by this man, and I wanted to understand him, and so I went and interviewed him. And I came to discover that he was part of this network called the New Apostolic Reformation. And the more I dug into them, the more I came to realize how much that actually overlapped with my own biography, because the New Apostolic Reformation came out of Fuller Seminary, where I was an alum. And it was kind of incubated in the spaces that I grew up in. And the New Apostolic Reformation is a network of non-denominational charismatic leaders who understand themselves to be modern-day apostles and prophets, who have been sent to bring about a global revival that will transform global Christianity and bring about the return of Christ. And this network got started in the 1990s and into the early 2000s and was kind of in the margins of American Christianity until Donald Trump hit the scene. And they were some of the first leaders to endorse Donald Trump, to embrace Donald Trump, and they have become the most effective Christian propagandists for Donald Trump in that time. And they were instrumental to what happened on January 6th. In my research, I have tracked more than 60 independent charismatic leaders and ministers who were there in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, including much of the core leadership of the NAR. And the book is really trying to understand where they came from and how they got to where they were, how they got to January 6th, and how it was that this phenomenon of Christian Trumpism came to be.
Thank you. Is the mic going in and out, Kurt? Okay.
Why don't I use the hand?
Yeah, we'll switch. Thanks for your patience with
Can
me,
I
everybody.
ask a follow-up to that too? Because
Sure, go for it.
the journalist in me. But can you speak to the overlap of the prosperity gospel with the movement that you cover and what the significance of that is?
Yeah, that's a very important question, actually. Again, it's very hard to conceptualize some of these groups and these movements because they come from places that actually feel very foreign unless you've inhabited them. When a lot of us think of non-denominational, we think of the absence of structure. But the reality is, especially in the non-denominational charismatic space, and by charismatic here we're talking about Christians who have built a spirituality around access to the supernatural, that they believe was the ethos of the early church. These are the Christians who speak in tongues, who believe in modern-day miracles, modern-day prophets, that sort of thing. In that space, it's a very unregulated space where you have kind of non-denominational governance and charismatic spirituality. And so all these strange and very influential movements have grown up in there. So Messianic Judaism is largely a non-denominational charismatic movement, grows out of that. And the prosperity gospel comes from another network called Word of Faith that is a part of that sector as well. Most televangelists are independent charismatics, and then the NAR and some of these apostolic and prophetic movements have emerged in that sector as well. A lot of the megachurches in our country are in that space. And so the prosperity gospel idea kind of it's spread throughout. I think of the independent charismatics less as like a movement and more like a soup, where you got a bunch of ingredients that are thrown in there. So you've got like ideas of Christian dominion, you've got these ideas of apostles and prophets, you got Messianic Judaism and this Christian Zionism, and then the prosperity gospel is another one of those. And anywhere where you go to sample the independent charismatics, you're going to take a bite and you're going to taste all those flavors, but you're going to get a different combination of them with every bite. So you might find Messianic rabbis who are also prosperity gospel people. You might find apostles and prophets who are also Christian Zionists, right? All those things are kind of in the mix, but they're all constantly being recombined because there's no institutions that are structuring them. They're just kind of, these ideas and movements are kind of flowing together all the time.
Yeah. And I think the New Apostolic Reformation also complicates that homogenization and some of the questions about gender and race, right? Yeah. Because you do have folks like Che Ahn, so you have people of color who are serving in leadership roles, and you don't have the same, the way in which whiteness is operating there is very different from the way that it's operating in some of the other spaces. And you also have women who are serving as very powerful apostles and leaders within that community. So I want to dig down a little bit on the whiteness question and race. And you speak a lot in your book, Angela, about white Jesus. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about who white Jesus is and how white Jesus manifests in American Christianity.
Yeah, and I think for many of us, and especially those of us who grew up as white Christians in Minnesota, which is a very white state, White Jesus is recognizable. He's Scandinavian. He's blonde. We see him in the walls of our churches and the stained glass windows. And the important thing the title of my book changed. It was not originally Disciples of White Jesus. And what happened is, as I was telling people, I was writing a book about young boys and men and the influence of right-wing Christianity and radicalization. I had so many people, many of whom were not familiar with the church, many of whom did not have a Christian background, from all different parts of America, who would come up to me and say, are you going to talk about white Jesus? And this place that white Jesus occupies, I think it's really important to understand that this archetype of white Jesus is very different from the Jesus of the Bible. And it can almost cause sort of a crisis of faith for many white Christians, because it causes some of these foundations of things that we built our faith on to shake a little bit. And I think part of that significance as well is that we take for granted, many white American Christians take for granted, that Jesus is one of us, that Jesus is like us naturally. And the reality is, when you start to investigate the Jesus of the Bible and understand the reality of the incarnation, that Jesus really did walk and live in the Middle East as a Jewish man in the first century, you understand how alien that experience is to white Christian growing up in the 21st century in Minnesota or wherever you grew up. And so some of the hallmarks of white Jesus are diametrically opposed to the Jesus of the Bible, and some of them have much more in common with a stereotypical white middle-class life. And if we don't break down that this white Jesus that we have been worshiping is not the Jesus of the Bible, then it's much easier for Christian nationalism and the prosperity gospel to take hold. Because you get this sense that, well, Jesus, wants us to be rich. Jesus wants Christians to have all the power. Jesus thinks that Christians should be the CEO and the head of the board. And we can't separate any of this from the growth of megachurches, from the growth of evangelicalism, from the growth of celebrity pastors, from the growth of TV ministry, radio ministry, online ministry, all of these things that sort of conflated Christianity with American capitalism. And I know when I went to seminary, and I'm sure you experienced some of this as well, there was really this sense that as a pastor, you needed to be CEO of your congregation. And the most important things that you had to track were attendance and giving. And those things better be on the up and up, or you're not doing your job. To the extent to which, we have pastors that are household names who were embraced by liberal mainline churches, guys like Rick Warren. And Rick Warren built his whole ministry on the construction of this ideal church member named Saddleback Sam. And Saddleback Sam was basically a wealthy white businessman in Southern California. And there became this idea that churches had to be financially successful. And so all of this became very tied together with who white Jesus is. But then, in the early 2000s, we also get the Mark Driscoll movement, which added on to this character of white Jesus, that white Jesus is also necessarily aggressive and angry and manly, because the churches were becoming too feminine. There were too many women in the churches, too many elderly women had power in churches. As a pastor, we love senior women. We need you. But the Mark Driscoll movement said, we need to create armies of Christian men, and so we're going to add paintball events for our young men at church, and this is the way that we're going to revitalize our churches and bring back men, because we're going to make Jesus not a sissy anymore. And again, all of this rhetoric is only possible if you ignore much of the biblical witness, and you instead construct your whole understanding of who Jesus is on a commercially viable enterprise that's based in whatever sells in American capitalism.
Yeah, thank you.
Matt, does white Jesus exist in the New Apostolic Reformation?
He does, in strange ways. So I have tried to move away when in talking about the New Apostolic Reformation and some of these more extreme expressions of Christian nationalism. I think they are expressions of Christian nationalism, but I think we need to recognize that they are distinct from the kind of garden variety Christian nationalism that we often find in the U.S. Right? There's a lot of Christian nationalism in the U.S. that's kind of sentimental, kind of nostalgic, kind of more rooted in emotion than theology. And then there are these movements like Doug Wilson's crowd, like some of these hardline Catholic nationalist crowd, and then like the NAR that are really deeply theological. And I call those Christian supremacy movements because they're not just caring about the nation, their ambition is global. They want Christians to rule over the earth. And America is just a stepping stone to that for them. And they're actually, especially in the NAR case, actively working on building that project elsewhere as well. So, and in the US, if you think of it like a Venn diagram, white supremacy is one circle, and then Christian supremacy is another circle. And they overlap greatly in the US, in part because of this history that you're describing, right? Of whiteness being this kind of dominant cultural force that imposes itself upon our theology, that imposes itself upon our vision of Jesus. And so I do think, a lot of the NAR folks are carrying around this notion of a white Jesus. But we also have to think outside the US, because in Brazil, there are dynamics around race. They're different than our dynamics around race. But many of the Christians who are attaching themselves to NAR paradigms there are not thinking in American racial terms, right? Same with Russia, same with China, same with Vietnam, right? There are Christians who are coming into these movements throughout Latin America, this charismatic spirituality. In fact, independent charismatics are the fastest growing religious movement in the world right now. In 1970, the estimate from the Center for the Study of World Christianity is that there are about 44 million independent charismatics in the world. By 2020, their estimate was up to 312 million. So you're talking about a movement that is, or a segment of Christianity that is roughly doubling in size every 20 years right now. And people are moving that direction. People are coming into these movements because they're very gravitational, they're very exciting, they're emotional, right? They're experiential. And so we have to be recognizing, this is what some of Susie and I have been working on more recently, there's a transnational dimension to Christian nationalism that's actually very, very important. Because there are ideas that are flowing into the United States that are being adapted and that are radicalizing people here. And there are also ideas flowing out of the United States that are being adopted and radicalizing people. And they aren't just Christian ideas. There are Hindu nationalist ideas that are being appropriated by Christians to propagate Christian nationalism. And then there are Christian nationalist ideas that are being appropriated by Hindu nationalists to propagate Hindu nationalism, right? So the part of it is that there are these far-right politics that are linking together authoritarian leaders like Donald Trump and Narendra Modi, but they're also linking together their followers and their movements, and that are tying together these kind of wannabe autocrats around the world who have the shared project of dismantling democracy. Well, they find all these connections. So in terms of white Jesus, yes, there's a space for that, and there is racism in these multi-ethnic churches and multi-ethnic networks, but it's a complicated kind of racism. It's the kind of racism that you find in multi-ethnic spaces where people of color are often tokenized. So just to give an example, I've seen some of these New Apostolic Reformation conferences where one of the women I write about in my book, her name is Cindy Jacobs, maybe one of the most talented and respected charismatic prophets in the world. And Cindy Jacobs, I've seen her do this at several conferences. She'll get to the end of the conference and say, I want all the women of color to come up to the stage. All the black women, all the Latino women, come up to the stage. We're going to pray over you. We're going to bless you. We're going to empower you. And all these people come up, and there's hundreds of people all in front, and she starts praying over them and prophesying over them and speaking these words of blessing and honor and love over them. And then she ends with, and you are being sent to your people.
You are the person who's going to reach your people and bring them here. Right? So that's the task, that's the target, and they're being instrumentalized, they're being tokenized into that role. And if you ask Cindy Jacobs, she would say, well, I love these people of color, I care for them, I'm empowering them, and that's the message that's being spoken, but then what's the agenda behind that is the question that I think fails to be asked.
I think too, understanding that global movement that link, and it's a far right authoritarian movement often that links these things together is really important, because as we saw in the conversation around the global United Methodist Church with conversation around LGBTQ issues and acceptance, you heard a lot of times from white American Christians this hesitancy to critique non-acceptance or prejudice against LGBTQ people in places like Africa or from non-white Christians, because it was somehow seen as maybe then you're being racist. And so there's been sort of this wall about how do we understand intersectionality in these movements. And I think it's important to understand, as Matt points out, that just because movements have a lot of people of color within them does not mean there's also racism within them. And also, we shouldn't understand or have this sort of prejudice that, well, Black Christians in Africa are necessarily not socially accepting of LGBTQ people, and that somehow this is an African ideology. Because more often it's a theology that's been imported in some cases, and also just tied to right-wing power grabs. So I think that's a really important key point. I also wanted to mention too, as we're looking at ways to push back against these movements, a popular saying in Christianity in general and in some of these movements is you've got to look at the fruit, right? And so one of the fruits that I think we need to look at is the proliferation of the abuse crisis within a lot of these non-denominational evangelical movements where you have individual pastors who have a great deal of wealth and power. And, I have had my own experiences of being a critic of denominationalism and the rules and the structures, but I think we also have to understand that those structures can be, and we've seen, of course, in the Catholic Church where they're not, and in the, but a danger of this movement is being borne out as we begin to see more and more reporting about abuse crises and instances of abuse, particularly of children and of women, within these movements, because there are no guardrails. And because the leaders of these movements are understood to somehow be specially spiritually protected, perhaps a special mission from God, chosen by God, even on a level with God, that there's no accountability or way to hold them accountable. So the abuse crisis is an important part of this conversation, and the ways that abuse proliferates in these kind of churches and settings.
Thank you. We're going to turn to your questions now. So if you could pass down your index cards, we'll have people coming down the aisles to collect them. Chuck will be handling. Are you having trouble with? Consistently use the mic, please. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chuck, for that reminder. Okay, before we turn to your questions, let me throw out another one for both of you. I'm going to go off script here and throw out a question that Matt and I were actually talking about a little bit as we were producing our podcast episode for this week. So, is Donald Trump a Christian nationalist? Yes or no? Or give me a longer answer than a yes or no.
He's not a deep one, but he's not a terribly deep person, so I don't know that we would expect him to be a deep one. I would say yes, he is a Christian nationalist. It's sometimes questionable whether he fully identifies as a Christian, because and I don't mean that in a kind of, oh, he's not a real Christian kind of sense. He's a Christian as much as anyone else. A Christian is somebody who professes faith in Jesus Christ, and he professes that, so he's a Christian in that sense. But he's fairly inconsistent, actually, about how he does that. This is why we'll talk about, am I actually going to heaven? Right? That's not a very Christian question, because most Christians assume that they are going to heaven, right? He's not really steeped in this stuff. He's more of a late in life learner of it. And I will say, I think for Trump, a lot of, starting in 2015 as he starts meeting some of these religious leaders and they start, I mean, the NAR, the way that they've built this mythology around Trump is prophesying about him. And so they're constantly issuing new prophecies about him. He's a Cyrus, he's a Jehu, he's like Job, he's like Esther. They're always connecting him to these biblical characters. And I think with Trump's ego, he was happy to receive all these things from people, and that's part of what endeared him to them was, like, right, George W. Bush probably would not have sat around and let people prophesy over him in public. Trump's like, fine, go ahead and do it. You're saying nice things about me, I'll take it, right? And so I think it was kind of a shallow, like, ego-stoking dynamic for a long time. Something really changed for Trump with the Butler, Pennsylvania assassination attempt. He was very scared by that. It really struck a chord very deeply in him that he's mortal, that he could have died. And in the second assassination attempt, the one that happened on the golf course in Florida, Mike Johnson was there in Florida. He was supposed to meet with Trump right after that. And so he and his wife were there processing with Trump after this assassination attempt. And he said publicly afterwards that he kept saying to Trump, God spared you for a reason. God spared you for a reason. And he's not the only one saying that to Trump. There's a lot of these people who surround Trump who keep saying this to him. And Trump's been repeating it. If you listen to the inauguration speech, if you listen to his victory speech on election night, when he's speaking off the cuff, when he's scripted, he keeps coming back to this idea, God saved me to save America. And that's a messianic self-conception. So on some level, I don't know that Trump thinks that Jesus is the Messiah. I think he thinks he's the Messiah. And he's willing to use Christian vocabulary to kind of frame that and speak about it. But I do think that in a very deep way, it's more personal. It's more personalist for him than it is about anything having to do with Jesus or white Jesus even.
Yeah, I would say very similarly that the thing that makes him unable to be a Christian nationalist is that in his own self-conception, particularly after those assassination attempts, he is the Messiah. And that's where in my definition, of Christian nationalism, when we begin to really see the idol of Christian nationalism shifting, and we begin to see the aesthetics that are being used and the imagery being used in this movement shifting, it really shifts from flags, military, Americana, to a lot of imagery of Trump himself. And some imagery, you saw when Trump was in the courtroom, there was imagery of like Trump kind of merging with Jesus with him in the background, a famous sketch that was done around this time. I think the helpful word for Trump that many of us know is opportunist, that he saw an opportunist. And what Christian nationalists saw, they saw, I think it was Stacey Patton, who's a professor at Howard University who came up with this. She said, that Christian nationalists saw in Trump an empty vessel that they could fill with their, and so I have always sort of maintained, yes, Trump is dangerous, but what is always much more troubling to me are these pastors and religious leaders. Trump is not a true believer. Mike Johnson's a true believer. J.D. Vance is a true believer. These are people that are very ideologically motivated. This Project 2025, and we're seeing in this second administration a very much ramped up ideological push to make America a Christian nationalist country. So no, and I think it's well taken. That is Trump a Christian? What does the word Christian mean in America anymore? If you ask young people in America, what does the word Christian mean? It's become much more of a racial and political signifier, which is unfortunate because, of course, Black Christians have been some of the most powerful Christians in this country. But culturally, many people, when you say the word Christian, they think of a white person, maybe a blonde woman who's wearing a cross necklace. And it becomes a cultural signifier. And for me as a pastor, religious leaders, we've got to take some of that responsibility. What's been happening on Sunday mornings? what have we been teaching people about Jesus? That this word Christian has come to mean something so hollow.
Thank you. So we have a question from the audience, which not surprisingly, people are turning to this, so what do we do? And particularly recognizing that the urgency of the influence and the alignment of some of these groups with political leaders who have a particular agenda with respect to power, and thinking about the election seasons in the US. So recognizing that there are these multiple different kinds of groups, as Matt was laying out for us, the question from the audience is which of these groups should we be focusing on over the next 2 years? Like who are the ones who have sort of the most influence that is concerning for our democratic system? And then the how. What do you see is needed right now in order to protect democracy and protect pluralism?
So I think it's actually, there's two sides to this. One is, which groups should we be monitoring closely? But those are not people to be persuaded. So I want to kind of split the answers a little bit. So there are three major Christian supremacy movements that have huge influence in our culture right now. I went through the whole list of different Christian nationalists. So it's these independent charismatic NAR crowd that's very central around Trump and very influential in kind of popular culture. There's the Doug Wilson Calvinist crowd, and Pete Hegseth is an acolyte of Doug Wilson. They have functionally just founded a new church in their denomination in Washington, D.C., in order to give Pete Hegseth a church to go to in D.C. And and then there's these kind of
from
Catholic...
Minnesota, don't forget Pete Hegseth.
And then there are these Catholic, like very hardline, kind of radical traditionalist influences, and their influence is much more through J.D. Vance, who's kind of one of their kind of mentees, and then the Supreme Court. And so I think we need to be paying very careful attention to what's going on in there. And because each of those, they're rivals to each other, but they're also coordinated and cooperating. And it's a very messy relationship, right? And even like the fight that's going on right now over anti-Semitism is about these different kind of strands of Christian nationalism and their different theologies pulling in very different directions. And they've managed to paper over all these fault lines for a long time because they have this shared agenda of power, as Angela was saying. But their visions of the future are very different. And those visions ultimately come into conflict. And I think there's opportunity there in those internecine kind of struggles between them. Those people are not persuadable, though, because you're never going to talk those people out of their vision. They might talk themselves out of it in the long term, but in the short term, they're winning. So why would they give it up, right? The people who are persuadable, this is how I've been trying to think about our country since the election. We're really a country that's divided into thirds. And coming into the 24 election, 1/3 of Americans consistently in surveys were saying that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. In order to believe that, you have to believe conspiracy theories, because there is zero evidence for it. Every investigation has shown that is wrong. And so those are the people who are locked in these information silos, these propaganda bubbles that they functionally, they don't know reality. And you can't have an argument with somebody who doesn't share a factual reality with you. That's the MAGA core. And the more people are drawn into Christian supremacy, the more people move into that bubble. Now, at the other end of the spectrum is the bubble that probably contains most of us in this room, what I call the blue bubble or the mainstream media bubble. And we live in reality, hopefully. We consume mainstream news, we listen to NPR, we read the New York Times, we're dialed in. Most of us are college educated. Most of us live in the blue dots on the map. But we have a narrow cultural consensus because we also only hang out with people who are like us. And so we think that our way of viewing the world is normal, and that anyone who does not agree with the way that things look from our third of the country must be idiots. And so everyone else thinks that we're smug. And they're kind of right. And then there's the middle third. And the middle third is very, very hard to define because it's very chaotic. This is the part of the country, this is the part of our population that has been most hard hit by globalization, most hard hit by industrialization, most hard hit by the changing dynamics in the family. And that third is neither authoritarian, like pro-authoritarian or anti-authoritarian. They just want something that will help their lives be better. And the main thing that divides their third from our third is education. Most of those people don't have a college education. Only about 35% of the country has a college education. And so the task is to fight rhetorically and debate with the Christian supremacy third and win over the middle third, to persuade them. And that means a mass campaign of persuasion, finding the Trump voters who are now asking questions about why they voted for Trump and saying, hey, whatever choices you've made in the past, come over to our side. If you believe in equality, if you believe in pluralism, if you believe that everyone should have the same rights in society, then you're with us and keeping them in our camp. That is the task for saving our democracy.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent electoral analysis, and it's a little bit sobering to really understand that nearly a third of the country is deep into conspiracy theories. But I think it's an important point to really understand just functionally, because even though, yes, we do have blue bubbles, also many of us have family members and friends who are in that place. And for those of us who do, it's important to know how to navigate those relationships. And so one of the places that I often point people to is the wisdom of the 12-step movement and Al-Anon. And to have this understanding of how to navigate these relationships, not through ideological argument necessarily, because it's not going to be productive, but maintaining a sense of relationship and trust is important in having some kind of functional community, democracy, country, and fighting back against some of the best weapons of authoritarianism and Christian nationalism, which are isolation and lack of trust. And so if we can break down some of those barriers of isolation and lack of trust, and again, I say this as someone who lived in Southwest Minneapolis and pastored a congregation in McLeod County. And people would think, how is that even possible? To be in two very different worlds where my kids were still home from school because of COVID, and the school districts out there were already saying, hey, COVID's not real, everybody's back, we're back to normal. But we do have more of us than we realize that do continue to have a foot in relationships in both worlds, particularly too also in the suburbs. And that's why we're starting to see the suburbs as a place where elections hinge and fall. From a pastoral perspective, outside of the electoral analysis and the importance of democracy, from a pastoral perspective and a community perspective, I think there's a sense of hopelessness and despair that has set in for a lot of people, and I hope that some of the election results that we saw on Tuesday, particularly in places like Georgia or Mississippi, are places that people can look and move away from some of that despair about, unfortunately, a lot of the reporting after the 2024 election had this sense that, okay, this is baked in now. Young white men are all going to be Trumpers, Christian nationalists. And I think we're starting to see that was a premature diagnosis. And it's much more this space of people that are not ideologically hardened. So from a pastoral perspective and from a grassroots perspective, I often urge people to look around this room and to see how many people on a Friday night in dark Minneapolis came out, found a parking spot, maybe some of you had to look for a while, and decided they wanted to talk about this topic and find solutions. And, after a really difficult summer here in Minnesota, with the assassinations of Melissa and Mark Hortman, with the school shooting and Annunciation very, very close to here, and close to my home as well, and close to our family's relationships as well. And then after the death of Charlie Kirk, and the ways that the anger and reaction to that death in right-wing circles, when many of these folks had nothing to say about Melissa Hortman or about Annunciation, the pain of coming out of all of that, one of the most helpful things that I heard in this wake of what do we do is figure out who your neighbors are. Figure out who knows how to cook, who can be a driver if people need a driver, who can be someone who can provide medical assistance if you need it. Rebuilding the neighborhood bonds and relational bonds that broke down during COVID is one of the best wedges against authoritarianism, because as Susie will tell you, in places that have fought back against authoritarianism, it's been because of community bonds and trust and relationships. And in places where authoritarianism has run rampant, like East Germany, like the Soviet Union, like Nazi Germany, it's because neighbors told on their neighbors. And we're in that place in America right now. In Oak Park, in Chicago, neighbors are having to decide, are we going to stand up and support our Hispanic siblings who are being pulled out of daycare centers and taken off the streets by ICE? Or are we going to work together? And I'm part of a moms group of Oak Park moms from some folks I know from Chicago before. And their courage and willingness to stand up for their neighbors is really heartening. And it's an opportunity that we have. This is not baked in America in this sense in any way. We still have a huge amount of power and opportunity to push this stuff back, and it starts in neighborhoods and relationships and trust and in local churches. We're still here. If your church is not espousing Christian nationalism, then you're a beacon. You're a lighthouse. Maybe the carpets need to be replaced and the roof is leaking and the budget is not great and the reserves are drawing down and the attendance isn't what it used to be. But I think local church pastors and small churches need to sort of stiffen up our spines a little bit and be proud of the work that you are doing, because you're important and it matters.
Yeah, thank you. That is important. And yes, I can attest that a lot of times in these countries that when the democratic movement arises, the resistance movement arises, it comes from the suburbs, it comes from the rural areas, it is the farmers in India who rose up, it is the suburbanites in Sri Lanka who rose up. So it really is that knitting together and going local, doing that dialogical work, doing that relationship building work, finding the places, care for the land that everybody can come around. We want to protect the health of the land that we all live on and care for. That those kinds of things can be what knits together and prevents the entrepreneurs from the top in driving those wedges and divides. So I'm going to do one last question from the audience, and this is a dilemma that's related to church and state. Both of you are calling in your books, and Matt, in your case, the book that is upcoming, for sort of theological narratives being lifted up in order to counter punch holes or undermine some of the theological narratives that are driving authoritarianism or driving harm against vulnerable communities. And this audience member is raising that they want to see their political leaders who identify with Christianity espousing a form of, something that feels more akin to the Jesus path and to the gospel ethic, but they also feel a trepidation in potentially sort of reifying or amplifying Christian theologies in a religious narrative related to politics in the state. So can you untangle that knot a little bit for them? What is the role of lifting up Christian theologies, but in a way that doesn't unintentionally reinforce a sense that Christianity is critical for thinking about what good governance and good politics and what being an American is?
Well, I will say, as a Lutheran pastor, I have been invited to speak to secularist groups on this topic. And when I do so as a Lutheran pastor. That's part of who I am, and I think one of the things that helps all of us to speak authentically to any of this without it being used as a cudgel or as a method to hold other people down is really knowing authentically where you are in your own faith. So I think my first urging for approaching feeling more confident doing this, and also looking to political leaders to do this, is an authentic spiritual practice of your own. It really does begin with a practice of prayer. It really does begin with an authentic faith of your own that people can point to and look to. And I would also point to, if we're looking for American examples of where this has been done, we've got to look to the Black church. We have an incredible historical witness in the United States of a movement of Christianity that truly sought liberation for everyone. Martin Luther King Jr. began working for civil rights. He began pushing against segregation, but his also guiding North Star light was advocacy for the poor and anti-poverty movements for everyone. One of my heroes as a Lutheran is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and his witness against Hitler and his courage to stand up against Nazism. But he gained much of that courage and inspiration from his time in America with leaders of the Black church. And again, it can get dicey because Christian nationalists know this, and so they'll say, well, look, we've got a Black pastor. So, we have to understand how to distinguish between the historic witness of the Black church and a multinational prosperity gospel church that is tokenizing Black leaders on the top. So I'd really point to the work of Jamar Tisby. He's done excellent work in helping to unpack why the witness of the Black church is so important in these days. And I would say it is that consistent witness towards a gospel that is inclusive, that is liberalizing, a gospel that is free. And I don't know if there's any Lutherans in the room, but I'll say for me as a Lutheran pastor and someone who, well, I do know, there's a few. I see a few of you, yes.
There's always a Lutheran in the room.
That's good. Right? Even got some pastors. What I see, and I think everybody should do this, even if you're not a Christian, if you're a Jewish person, if you're a Muslim person, find a piece of your theology that pushes back against this authentically. Find it in the scriptures. For me as a Lutheran, it is that theology of the cross. And this insistence on a gospel that sets people free, on a gospel that is not something that we earned, that is not something that says, well, aren't I such a good person, so I am saved, but you're not. That is the insistence for me of the Reformation. And I think that is the witness that I want to push forward.
That's very well taken. That's great. So I'm going to start with constitutional law and then segue into theology. Because there's different versions of secularism, the separation of church and state. And in some of those versions, say in historic Turkey or in France, there's a very strict separation of church and states to the point where it's a separation of church and politics, where religion is pushed out of the public square, and this is why there are fights over whether women can wear hijab in certain buildings in Turkey, or whether women can wear a burkini at the beach in France, right? That there's a sensibility that religion needs to be a private thing that should not enter into politics. And frankly, what usually happens in those systems is religious minorities get abused and religious majorities get to tacitly keep bringing their religion into the public square. So I don't think that's a good system. I think we have a better system, historically in the United States, of separating church and state, which means there's space for religious voices and religious arguments in the public square, but the government maintains a neutrality towards religious communities and non-religious communities, that everyone has the right to exercise their religion freely, right? So I think that's a good thing, and I think that Democrats and others who want to push back on Republicans would do well to use their religious voices in doing so, would do well in speaking about their own religious identities, their religious values, and how that shapes their political ideas. So that's the constitutional law part. Theologically, as a Christian, I don't think Christianity was ever intended to be at the center of any society. Go back and look, and this is what Angela was suggesting earlier, go back and look at the life of Jesus in the early church. I think what Jesus brought when it came to politics was actually a critique of the pursuit of building power, a critique of the way that people are seeking after power for themselves and power for their community. And what he said was, that's the way of Caesar. That's the way of the world. But not so among you. Go and read Mark chapter 10, right, where Jesus says, the lords of the Gentiles love to lord it over you, and their great ones are tyrants over you, but not so with you. Instead, if you want to be great in the kingdom of God, become the servant of all, become the slave of all, because that's my model, is what Jesus is saying, right? The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so I think what we find throughout the Gospels is Jesus is consistently critiquing and challenging the hierarchies in his society, right? Every time he encounters a power differential, he's either mocking it or overturning it. And I think that we need to have a similar approach within our society, not to put ourselves in the center of the story and say, this is a Christian nation, or we need to live by Christian values, and we got the real Christian values, and they got the fake ones, and we're going to assert our real Christian values. That's just reifying a new form of Christian nationalism, maybe a liberal form of Christian nationalism, but it's still putting Christians at the center. But instead, if we are following the way of Jesus, I think we need to put the concerns of other people in front of our own. And so Christians should be the weirdest voters of all. We should be the voters that no political scientist and pundit can predict, because we're always trying to think through who are the least, who are the lowest, and how do we serve them? What policies will serve them? How do we put them at the center of the story? Because that's what Jesus was constantly doing. So I think we need to use our religious voices in the public square, but not use them in a way that is coercive or building our power, but is looking to displace our power or use whatever cultural power we have to serve and care for the lowest and the least and the most needy. And I'll say this as well, many of those lowest and least and most needy do not share citizenship and nationality and location with us. And if we are truly going to follow the path of Jesus with our politics, then we have to be concerned about the globe. Because Jesus didn't come for America, he didn't come for Israel, he didn't come for any nation, he came for humanity. And as long as human beings share humanity with us, then they also are blessed by the incarnation, they also share the image of God, and they have every much a right to dignity and our concern as our fellow citizens do.
It's beautiful from both of you. Thank you. I want to invite Rudy up. Thank you, Rudy. And I'm shifting to this because Angela and Matt are directing us in a very persuasive way and a very moving way to engage in works of theology and works of political action based on those theologies of the cross and the gospel ethic. And I'm inviting Rudy up to offer another invitation to a way to engage as well. It's consistent, I think, with what we're hearing from these two.
Hello, yeah, my name's Rudy Anders, and I'm a member here at Creekside, and also a member of the Isaiah team here. Let me go off script immediately and say thank you, because I think a lot of what you said really sort of resonates with me and I think Isaiah. So I'm grateful to have had this evening with all of you to better understand the roots of Christian white nationalism, the threat it poses, and how it is enabling our current descent into authoritarianism. I want to invite you, and that is you folks, to an upcoming event called Light in the Storm, a statewide anti-authoritarian strategy training session. This is an event led by Isaiah, and it's happening on December 13th from 1 to 6 in the Minneapolis Convention Center. But first, a little context. Isaiah is a multiracial, multi-faith, statewide community to say a big no to far-right Christian nationalism. We're aligned nationally with 31 other such community organizations. In Isaiah, we don't just say a big no, but we offer a big yes, and I think this is where I think of you. We have to build a mandate for a progressive, what we call a progressive agenda, and I think to build a more just Minnesota through the next few years. At Light in the Storm, the convocation we're having, more than 4,000 Minnesotans are coming together to get trained, to lead this path, and we obviously hope that you'll join us. One of the initiatives that we're launching on December 13th is a Palm Sunday organizing path to reclaim our faith in the public square. And in that sense, we are standing up for our core values. And I think Isaiah emphasizes this. We have to come from our values, our core values. And I'm simplifying them, but look, feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, and welcoming the stranger. We are launching a national path towards a season of direct actions, and particularly a mass action on Palm Sunday, March 29, 2026. More than 2,000 Christians from over 150 churches will gather together to prepare to lead this path in Minnesota. Now, our Muslim coalition partners and other groups in Isaiah will also train and launch their paths as well. At Light in the Storm, I don't know why I'm having trouble with that. On December 13th, everyone will be equipped and invited to take concrete steps in building organized people power. We need that to protect our communities and to build a better future together. So please consider attending. If you haven't gotten a flyer from us, there'll be some in the narthex there, and you can sign up yourself, or you can stop at the table and ask us some questions. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks, Reed. This is the real deal, folks. I mean, this is a multiracial, multi-religious effort that is very well organized, and it is a tangible way that you can step into this work of gospel ethic, of aligning with others across the state and across the country to do this work of offering a different way and shining a different kind of light to attract folks who are struggling with the current systems right now that are causing harm. So I do hope that you will sign up to at least learn more about it. There's a QR code in your bulletin that you can use as well to register for it, or stop on the way out and talk to the folks at the table. Also, just a shout out on the back that Matt and I have a podcast called American Unexceptionalism, where we look at some of those transnational ties between religious nationalist groups and highlight from other contexts the effective strategies that have worked in order to build multiracial, multi-religious resistance movements to protect democracy and to protect pluralism. So do use the QR code for that as well if you want to hear more from Matt and me on some of those topics. Thank you to our guests for your wise insights tonight, for what you shared of your hearts and what you shared of the work that you have been doing. We are grateful for it. Thank you to all of you who joined us tonight and for your thoughtful questions, and for those who joined us online. We do have their books for sale in the narthex as a reminder. And after we finish up here, let's, kind of like we're on a plane and they're trying to make a tight connection, allow them to go through the aisles first in order to get out so they can be there to sign the books for anybody who wants that. We're really grateful that you participated in this. Thank you.